Welcome. A number of years ago, I entered a poetry competition. I didn't win, and I didn't think about it again for maybe a year or two afterwards, when I thought I could use that poem again for a different purpose. I looked in my files, it was nowhere to be found. I thought, I'm wasting my time here. I know what the poem was about. I can even remember some of the important lines of it. I thought it will not take me long to write a short poem again. So I did it. I wrote down that poem again. Now, I hadn't memorised the poem, and so when I wrote it the second time, I'm sure there were all sorts of little differences from the first time when I wrote it. Did David repeat any psalms? Well, yes, he did. He repeated them with little differences, like the little differences when I repeated my poem. So Psalm 14, which we looked at about a year and a half ago, that is repeated as Psalm 53. But if you want to do a comparison, word by word, in it, between those two psalms, you'll find lots of little differences. And you'll also find one very big difference. When you come to Psalm 53 and verse 5, and you compare it with the equivalent verses in Psalm 14, you'll find a very big difference there. So yes, David did repeat psalms, but he repeated them with differences. They were different versions, maybe even different psalms. So today we're looking at the second of those. It's Psalm number 53. My name is Keith Simons. I'm a Bible teacher from England, and I present these talks how you can understand the King James Version using the book of Psalms. We've been through about 80% of the book of Psalms, just looking at it word by word and verse by verse, seeking to understand its meaning. In today's talk, our subject is Psalm 53, and because of those important differences, I'm not going to say too much about how Psalm 53 compares with Psalm 14. I'm going to look at Psalm 53 in its own right and for what it says itself, because I think when David wrote this psalm for the second time, he maybe was thinking of some things that were a little different from the first time when he wrote it. Okay, so if David repeated this psalm, why did he repeat it? Well, there's a clue in the ancient title. It says, to the chief musician upon Mahalat, Maskil, a psalm of David. Let's go through the ordinary bits of that title first. To the chief musician, that's the leader of the music in God's house, the temple or the tabernacle. And then David is stated as the author. He describes it as a maskil, a teaching psalm. There's lessons to learn from this psalm. And then the unusual phrase, which only appears in the heading of one other psalm, I think, upon Mahalat. That means sickness. And that, I think, is very possibly a clue for why David wrote this psalm for a second time. We read in the historical books of the Bible how David, near the end of his life, suffered from great weakness. His body became so cold that he could not keep himself warm. And during that time of illness, or maybe another time of illness in David's life, I can imagine David thinking about the Psalms and his thoughts turning to Psalm 14. He didn't have the psalm in front of him, Maybe he wasn't well enough to be reading Psalms. So he thought about it in his mind. And as he thought about it in his mind, he began to compose that psalm, to write it down again. Just as I, when I did that poetry competition and repeated the psalm later, the poem later. So David repeated the psalm. He could remember where it began. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. And then he tried to remember the remainder of it. And God's Holy Spirit guided him to write a psalm which was in many, many ways similar to the previous version, but in a few ways different. So let's turn to the psalm itself. And beginning with verse 1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. I've heard this said as a criticism of atheists, saying that an atheist is a fool, but that's not David's meaning. When David talks of a fool, he's describing someone who is so foolish that they've turned away completely from God. He's describing someone who's turned to wicked behaviour and deliberate wicked behaviour. And he's saying something by his actions, not by his words necessarily, but by his actions. He's saying it in his heart. He's thinking it deep inside himself. What is this wicked person thinking? He's thinking, there is no God. I can get away with any evil thing I want to do. I can be as selfish as I like. I can deal with people as cruelly as I like, because there is no God who is going one day to punish me. There is no God who's going to stop me in my evil behaviour. I can do whatever pleases me. And that is how very wicked people think. If they thought about God, if they thought about his judgment, if they expected him to act against them, then maybe they would be afraid to do the evil things that they are doing. But no, they've turned away from God and into such an evil way. The verse again, corrupt are they, and have done abominable iniquity. There is none that doeth good. Corrupt, decaying, like decaying fruit, which starts out so sweet and good, but then it goes bad, with a badness which doesn't just mean you can't eat it, it spreads to the other fruit. It causes no end of difficulty and problem. And if you've got a bad apple in a box of apples, you have to remove it, or else it will turn your entire box bad. Corrupt are they, and have done abominable iniquity. Abominable in English means extremely bad. The Hebrew word means that it's deserving of hate. It means that their iniquity, their evil deeds, well, we should hate those evil acts. We should hate murder and adultery and treating poor people cruelly. These things we should hate. There is none that doeth good. They've all turned aside, all turned away from what is right. And all around me, says David, there are people who have chosen to do evil, and no one who's choosing to do what is good. And if that is David's assessment of the world around him, then how severe is God's assessment as he looks down from heaven and sees this world that he has created and the people who should live as his children and serve him? When, verse 2, God looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand, that did seek God. Yes, God looks down. God observes us In all our thoughts and deeds and actions, he knows what we're doing. He knows what we've said in our hearts. And when God looks down, he looks down in the hope of finding what is good. He's looking to see if there were any that did understand. He's looking to see if there were any that did seek God. Those who've chosen the way of wisdom, those who've chosen to obey God, to serve him, or at least to seek him, who want to know him, who want to live in the way that is right. And God looks down, the judge of all people, and he assesses this world which he created and the people whom he created, and he announces his judgment in verse 3. Every one of them is gone back. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Every one of them has gone back from the right way. They've turned back like someone who is going on a journey and abandons the right journey and chooses to go in the opposite way. They're altogether become filthy. The Hebrew word there for filthy means morally corrupt. They've altogether, every one of them, chosen to do what is morally corrupt, what is evil. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. And God looks at our world, and his assessment of our world is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Yes, there are some that are deliberately evil, like in our first verse, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. But every one of us has to acknowledge that we are guilty of sins and of evil deeds, that none of us have lived perfectly in God's way. We've chosen the way our parents and grandparents did before us, of living our lives for ourselves, not putting God in the first place, not obeying his laws totally. And if we obey them reluctantly and hesitatingly, much preferring to do our own thing to what God has said is right and good. Now, that's God's assessment in this psalm of the people in this world. And yet, there are references in this psalm to the people of God. Verse 4 speaks of my people, God's people. And so we've got this contradiction here, and it's a very curious contradiction. The psalm is saying that every one of them has turned away from God. There is none that doeth good. And at the same time, it says there are a people who have turned from their evil deeds, who are living for God, who've received God's forgiveness, and who are serving him so that God can call them my people. And isn't that a challenge for us? A challenge for us whether we are going to go with our natural instincts to do what is wrong and be led in the way of the fool, led in the way of the person who says there is no God. Or are we going to be the people who turn to God, who confess our sins to him, who ask him in his great mercy and love to forgive us and to receive us as his people? Verse 4, God is still speaking here, and he's speaking about the people who work iniquity, the people who choose to do sinful and evil acts. God says, have the workers of iniquity no knowledge? Who eat up my people as they eat bread? They have not called upon God. So we're back to people like the fool in verse 1. These are the people who've chosen to do evil deliberately. They're not the simple people of verse 3 who've just fallen into evil deeds because they didn't know what was right or good to do. No, these are people in verse 4 who've deliberately chosen to be workers of iniquity, to do the work of evil. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread? How do you eat bread? How did they eat bread in Bible days? Well, bread was baked in an oven, flat bread, which people would eat at a meal. They'd tear it apart, they'd dip the bits into a soup or a sauce, and then they'd just eat them. And you can imagine just how quickly people gobble up their bread, tearing it apart, dipping it, eating it, chewing it, without hesitation, without thought. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread? Yes, the way they tear apart that bread, the way they grind it between their teeth, that's how careless they are with the cruelty against God's people. Yes, they are so evil. They dare to attack and even to kill God's people. And the final assessment of them, verse 4, they have not called upon God. In verse 2, the assessment is, there were none that did seek God. At the end of the day, the question is whether we seek God, whether we call upon God, whether we turn to God. That's the assessment of our lives. Verse 5, there were they in great fear where no fear was. As I've said already, verse 5 is the big difference between this psalm and Psalm 14, which it almost repeats. And it is similar. It begins the verse and it ends the verse in similar ways. But the middle of the verse is very different. But this phrase which I've just read, which begins it, there were they in great fear where no fear was. Who was in fear where no fear was? Well, I found two answers to that question from the books, and only one can be right. The one answer is that it's the people of God. Well, let's try it with that, and then I'll go with the answer I prefer. There were they in great fear where no fear was, for God has scattered the bones of him that encampeth against thee. So God's people were in fear, but there was no need for them to fear because God acted to scatter the bones of the enemy. Okay, that's one explanation of this section. It is saying that God was protecting his people, although they were in great fear. They were worrying needlessly because God had acted against the enemy. So why don't I like that explanation? I don't like that explanation because in the Bible God acts in response to our faith and not our fear. God acts when his people put their trust and their confidence in him, and trust and confidence is the opposite of fear. So what's the other explanation in the commentaries? Well, that is, maybe the they in this sentence is referring to the enemy. Then were they, the enemy, in great fear where no fear was. Where no fear was. That's a curious expression. It suggests people who are acting with great overconfidence. The workers of iniquity, verse 4, who eat up my people as they eat bread. Yes, there was no fear there. There was no fear of God. There was no fear of judgment Why? Verse 1, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Yes, no fear was in the workers of iniquity, the fools in their cruel behaviour. But there were they in great fear. A sudden change. They're suddenly placed in great terror because God is acting powerfully against them. How is God acting powerfully against them? God hath scattered the bones of him that encampeth against thee. Thee, you, probably means Jerusalem here. And this enemy was encamped against Jerusalem. He built his camp around Jerusalem. He was trying to arrange a siege against Jerusalem, where no one could enter or leave the city, but until the time when he could attack the city and destroy it. And in this situation, God acted against that fierce enemy. God scattered the bones of the enemy. In other words, the enemy died. And the enemy died in such a terrible way that the dead bodies of the enemy soldiers couldn't even be buried. They were scattered. They were pulled apart by vultures and by wild dogs feasting on the dead bodies. A shameful thing to happen to a proud and evil army. Thou hast put them to shame, the psalm continues, because God hath despised them. Thou, remember, we're talking now to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's people have put the enemy to shame. They've defeated the enemy, and they defeated the enemy in a way that the enemy would have considered shameful. If they'd have been defeated, at least they'd have wanted proper graves. But that wasn't possible because God acted. God hath scattered. God hath despised them. To despise means to reject someone, to treat them as worthless. These proud people, these people who claimed to be great, destroyed, defeated, shamefully defeated. Verse 6, the last verse. David writes, "Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion." Zion, a poetic name for Jerusalem, but especially for the place where the temple was later built, the place of God's house in Jerusalem. And David is looking to the day when the salvation of Israel comes out of Zion. God from his house rescues Israel. Salvation, the Hebrew word is plural there. It's plural to indicate that we're talking about complete salvation, complete rescue, complete safety. The complete safety of Israel's people when they come into a right relationship with God. As Paul wrote in Romans, all Israel shall be saved. When God bringeth back the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad. The captivity, the prisoners, those who've been taken captive. David sees God bringing back the prisoners who Israel's enemy have taken away, hostages in a foreign country. It seemed impossible to rescue them, to save them, but God acts in power to save them. And then Israel's people rejoice. Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad. Jacob is another name for Israel. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, is the ancestor of the Jewish people, and God changed his name to Israel. But here it's not referring to Jacob the man, it's referring to Jacob as a name for Israel, to emphasize the whole of Israel rejoicing at the return of the prisoners. How much did they rejoice at the return? Psalm 126. Let me read you the first couple of verses. When the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter, and our tongue with singing. Then said they among the heathen, the Lord hath done great things for them. Please write to me. My email address is 333kjv@gmail.com. That's 333kjv@gmail.com. And my name is Keith Simons. Now in conclusion, here is the whole of Psalm 53. To the chief musician upon Mahalat, Maskil, a psalm of David. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Corrupt are they, and have done abominable iniquity. There is none that doeth good. God looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand, that did seek God. Every one of them is gone back. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Have the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread? They have not called upon God. There were they in great fear, where no fear was. For God hath scattered the bones of him that encampeth against thee. Thou hast put them to shame, because God hath despised them. Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion. When God bringeth back the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad.